Hi there, this is Jessie from Faraway Road, and this video is the alternate part 2 in how to English paper piece using Snowflakes freezer paper shapes. In part 1, we talked about supplies and how to prepare your shapes to be stitched together, and in part 2, I showed you how to join your pieces using the ladder stitch. I also want to show you the Whipstitch, which is possibly the more common stitch that people use to join English paper piecing. So that you can make your decision between the two different stitches. The whip stitch makes it a little easier to get a tight seam and a sturdier seam, and the ladder stitch I find is easier to make an invisible seam. So you really have to just think about what's the most important thing for you, and maybe try both of them before you decide which one you're going to use on your project. So to get started, I'm going to tie a quilter's knot in the end of my thread. By doing that, I pinch the tail of my thread right next to the needle, wrap the thread around the needle 4 times. I'm going to pinch those wraps with my left hand and push the needle through. Now continue holding the wraps in your left hand until you've pulled the thread the whole way through, and then when you let it go, you've got a perfect little knot there at the end of your thread. So I'm going to sew these two pieces together first. I'm going to just fold them together like a book and hold the seam that I want to sew facing me. Now I don't want to start sewing right here on the edge because I don't want my knot right there at the beginning of the seam. Chances are if any stress is put on your quilt, the knots might start to pop out if they're right there. So what I like to do is anchor the knot down here in the seam allowance first and come up right at the point. Now I'm ready to take one stitch through both pieces. I'm trying to catch maybe 2 or 3 threads on each side. I like to pull it through until you have one little loop left and put my needle through the loop and pull it tight. Now I want to tie another knot right there just to make sure that my seam is really nice and secure. So I've just made a U shape with my thread. I'm going to put the needle under that U and pull it through one time. Okay. Now to whip stitch, what you're going to do is just start taking tiny little stitches through both pieces. Each time you're only catching maybe 2 or 3 threads. And you're aiming for about 14 to 16 stitches per inch. I'm not pulling these really tight just yet, but you certainly can if you want to. See how they make a nice kind of diagonal lines across the seam. I usually stop after about 8 to 10 stitches and pull really tight. And then I'm going to keep going. You definitely are not sewing through the paper on this step, and you should not even feel the needle rubbing against the paper. If your needle is grazing the paper each time you take a stitch, then you're taking too deep of a bite and your stitches are going to be really visible on the front side. So aim for just a tiny little bite, just 2 or 3 threads. And again, keep pulling it really tight. The reason we pull the stitches so tight is because after you're done stitching and you unfold this in the quilt, these 2 folds are going to be touching each other, and they'll be a lot closer than they were while you were stitching. So you have to make sure that you pull it really nice and tight, or else there'll be some gaps in your seam. I folded that little tab out of the way while I was sewing under it. But before you take your last stitch, I'm going to put the tab back where it belongs. That helps you to get a nice sharp point. So I'm going to put my last stitch through both of those points. Make another little loop there. And pass my needle through that loop. Pull tight. And then I'm going to make another knot right there. Alright, so now that's done front and back. Oops. I want to anchor the thread again on this side by passing just through the seam allowance here. And then I'm going to make another knot right here to anchor the thread. Again, so that knot at the end of the seam isn't just ready to pop out. I feel like this makes the quilt a lot sturdier. Alright, so that's what it looks like on the back. You can see on the front the stitches are visible a little bit. You can see those little specks of black in there. If you had chosen a matching thread or a light neutral, like I probably would have used this gray if I wasn't trying to use, to illustrate this sewing. The stitches would be a lot less visible if you had used a matching thread. So it's still, as long as your stitches are nice and uniform and you're not taking really huge bites, it could still be an attractive seam. And like I said, it's a more durable choice than the ladder stitch. So if I was making a bag, say, something that would get a lot of use, I would go ahead and use the Whipstitch. Alright, after your pieces are all joined, then you want to get a seam ripper and pop these basting threads. Pull the knots from the back to get the basting threads out, and then remove your papers. They just peel right off, and then your piece is ready to quilt.